welcome to the program. We're back after having taken a few weeks off for the holidays. What happened in city government in our absence? Well, not too much, for we weren't the only ones on vacation. However, one notable issue was the reemergence of an old debate about Seattle's so-called intelligence ordinance. Dating back to the 1970s, it prohibits police from opening files and collecting information on citizens unless they are suspected of criminal wrongdoing. What does this law say and why the renewed debate? We take that up today in our interview segments. City Attorney Tom Carr joins us, as well as Jerry Sheehan, the legislative director of the local ACLU. All that ahead after our news. Well, he died a few years back, but local columnist Emmett Watson may finally be getting his cherished dream, a lesser Seattle. New figures show that the city is on the verge of having more people move out of town than move into town. It's hard to imagine, given the traffic gridlock, construction cranes, and all the rest. The culprit, the sinking economy, which has left many out of work and therefore seeking a new place to live. If Seattle's population does indeed decline in the coming year, it will be the first time since the 1970s. Well, what doesn't seem to be slowing down, however, is the amount of garbage Seattleites produce. There's nothing lesser about that. But Margaret Pagler wants there to be. She recently suggested that the city work to reduce the amount of garbage waste that is being generated by citizens. Her remarks came as the city is questioning whether it can indeed meet its goal of recycling 60% of all trash produced. Right now, the figure is 40%. Increasing that number, however, is expensive in terms of more trucks collecting recyclables. Pagler says that a better, more cost-effective way may be to help citizens reduce the garbage waste they generate in the first place. Well, it may not reduce traffic congestion much, but new figures show that more people in Seattle are going to work by foot. Nearly 8% of Seattle citizens commute that way. Indeed, walking is getting more attention from City Hall. Virtually all the neighborhood plans developed in the last few years have included requests for more marked crosswalks. The council this week voted not only to help accommodate those proposals, but also to make sure that the entire pedestrian experience is enhanced in Seattle. Studies show that crosswalks by themselves aren't the only safety measure worth exploring. The leader on this issue for the council is Richard Conlon.
Council members are often presented by neighborhood groups or persons with requests for crosswalks. People feel that they need to have their safety better protected when they're crossing streets. What this resolution does is it takes that idea that we get, the request for crosswalks, and recognizes that that's really symptomatic of the need for more improvements in the pedestrian environment. That a crosswalk by itself doesn't necessarily lead to a safe crossing.
As is typical of late, there was some talk about City Light at City Hall this week. Heidi Wills introduced legislation to begin a risk management study. She was met with at least some skepticism from colleague Judy Nicastro, who wondered aloud about how all the City Light studies, audits, reviews, oversights, and committees are going to be connected and related.
We seem to be discussing a bunch of ways to better be educated and manage the utility, and I'm not clear on where they're all sort of heading to in this respect of here we are, this would hire a consultant to look at risk management. There's also been talk about the mayor setting up a task force which people would be paid $500 to give us advice, to give him advice, to give us advice. I'm not clear on what that task force would do yet. That doesn't seem to be fully hashed out. And the third element is the council. We've discussed from the audit report an oversight committee, utility oversight body, and I don't know where that's at either. So I'm seeing a lot of sort of stuff going on, don't have the big picture.
And it's approximately $500,000, which represents less than 0.5% of Seattle City Light's budget. And I would say that those are dollars well spent, because the fact that we don't have adequate risk management policies in place means that we stand to lose much more dollars. And perhaps, and this came forward in the Vantage Consulting audit, if we had had robust risk management policies in place, hindsight's 2020, but looking back, would we have been as exposed to the market as we had? Would we be in debt to the extent that we are? So I think that these are dollars well spent as we're looking forward, particularly in the fact that we are cash strapped and we cannot afford any further debt.
There are new questions about whether Seattle's intelligence ordinance will hamper the city's role in the national war on terrorism. Since 1979, it has been illegal for the Seattle police to create files on people who haven't already done wrong. Up until that time, police regularly tracked the political and religious affiliation of suspect citizens, especially during the 60s and the anti-war protest period. The 79 law prohibiting this has generally been well regarded, but there may be a new snag, namely the federal government's war on terrorism. Seattle's law may preclude the city from being connected to the new National Anti-Terrorism Database. This because the local law prohibits the type of information local police can gather and receive from other law enforcement agencies. Is it time for a change, as some, including Seattle's police chief, are saying? We'll look at that topic in depth later in this program. But not before we talk about parking. A new city report offers recommendations about how Seattle can better manage parked cars. One pilot proposal to be launched shortly will include parking meters that accept credit cards. That one I love. No more mounds of change to lug around. Initiative 80, the so-called Save the Creeks measure, has hit a dry spell. Turns out they didn't collect enough valid signatures from citizens. The proposal, which would mandate creek and stream restoration throughout Seattle, now has until January 24th to gather around 1,000 more signatures from city residents. Supporters hope to meet the deadline, which would make the initiative eligible for the fall ballot. And now for our neighborhood roundup. Dateline Coleman Park, a Mount Baker resident who has admitted to cutting down over 100 mature trees on parkland won't face criminal charges by the county prosecutor. The man, an adjacent property owner, says the tree cutting was a misunderstanding between him and his gardener. The city of Seattle, however, is expected to file civil charges where the standard of proof is lower than the county's. This news for all neighborhoods. New 2003 branch library hours are as follows: Monday through Wednesday, 1 to 8 p.m., Thursday through Saturday, 10 to 6, and Sunday, 1 to 5 p.m. And speaking of libraries, the West Seattle branch is next up for renovation as part of the city's effort to upgrade all of its neighborhood branches. The West Seattle Library will close its doors on January 19th and reopen this fall. In the meantime, residents are encouraged to use the new Delridge branch. And this from Capitol Hill, the Volunteer Park Water Tower is again open for visitors. It had been closed for renovation. The hours are Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. to dusk. And now our City Inside Out calendar. Here are some events we think you might be interested in the coming weeks. The City Club is sponsoring the debate over sound transit. That should be a good one. It's Ron Sims versus former Governor Booth Gardner, and that takes place on Thursday the 16th at noon. Join the celebration honoring Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday on Tuesday the 17th from 8 to 10:30 a.m. at the Center House on the Seattle Center grounds. The City Council will be holding its annual retreat on Thursday, January 23rd all day. The public is invited to attend. Among other things, the Council will be developing its 2003 work plan. And finally, the many monorail neighborhood meetings are set to begin. Residents interested in hearing about the status of the plan and want to give input on the route and design are encouraged to attend. Here are the first three: West Seattle, January 21st, Downtown, January 22nd, Ballard, January 23rd. All events will be from 4 to 8 p.m. And as always, you can get more information about these events from our website at www.seattlechannel.org. We end today with some pleasant news. Seattle was recently named the second fittest city in all of America, just behind Honolulu. That comes from Men's Fitness magazine. Another fact we can be proud of: Seattle's most recent murder rate is the lowest in 40 years. Is there a connection between the two? Well, who knows, but let's celebrate while we have the facts on our side. That wraps up our news. After a quick pause to regroup, we welcome Seattle City Attorney Tom Carr. He discusses the city's aforementioned intelligence ordinance, and later the legislative director of the local ACLU gives his thoughts on changing that law. Stay with us. We're back in a moment. We now welcome Tom Carr. He is the city attorney for Seattle. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Let's just go through briefly this ordinance. What does and doesn't it allow the city police department to do?
You know, that's one of the big problems. It restricts the collection of files, and that's the intent. The ordinance, as you can see, is substantial, and one of the problems with it is it's not really very clear. It restricts gathering what they call restricted information. But restricted information is defined.
That begs the question.
Yeah. No. When restricted information, when not emphasized in Section 1412.6, it goes on, means any information within sections 1 through 3 of this subsection K. When emphasized is excludes. How do you explain that to a cop on the street?
Right.
And it also restricts them from using informants in certain circumstances. It restricts them from infiltrating certain organizations.
But here's the idea. In the 70s, 60s, and 70s, and up until the law was passed in 79, there were clear cases where the police would open files on people who just were at a protest rally. They'd take pictures. They had sexual history, sexual habits of some people, religious affiliations. I mean, here are some people, I just named them. Stimson Bullet, Lloyd Cooney, two big broadcasters in Seattle, they had a file. Reverend Sam McKinney of the Mount Zion Baptist Church, he had a file. Charles Royer, of all people, who ends up signing this law, had a file. Walt Crowley, political guy in town, Larry Gossett, current King County Council member. The idea was that it looked kind of absurd to have files on these people who were perhaps anti-war protesters, perhaps exercising their free speech rights.
Yes.
How many other cities ended up doing what Seattle did? That's to say, tried to curtail this kind of activity.
I think most cities and even the federal government have tried to curtail this activity. I mean, the federal government has a provision that you can ask for a copy of any file the federal government has on you. So that you can see what information they've
I think
collected.
people even have their FBI files.
Yes, you can get your own FBI
These were
file.
sort of, in effect, a local version of the FBI file.
Absolutely, and it was the sort of thing that was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it's not done anymore, and in large part because of laws like this.
Was ours, I think ours was one of the first in the nation, if not the first?
The Federal Freedom of Information Act, I think, was probably the first, and that sort of gave the Access to Justice Act. And, but yes, we were probably a leader in this.
So here's the idea. Well, here's the problem, I guess, now is the question in this sort of new post 9/11 era and, very sophisticated criminals. Does this law restrict the police, shackle the police from doing, doing what they need to do? Without taking an opinion on it, because I don't think you can as city attorney, what exactly is just the claim there?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that it restricts the police, and that the police could do a better, more effective job if this law didn't exist. But that's a choice that we make. If the exclusionary rule didn't exist, the police could do a better, more effective. If the Miranda rule didn't exist, the police could do a better job. Those are good rules that protect us. As a society, we make that choice. That is, we have certain laws, because we trust people with guns and the ability to take away our liberty, we restrict them. And we're willing to let some criminals get off because we want to protect our own liberties. And that's what the exclusionary rule, that's what Miranda does, and that's what this law does. I mean, this restricts the police. Does it restrict the police unfairly? Probably not. I mean, we're one of the safest cities in America. It does make their job more difficult. And as I said, it is a very complex law. And perhaps after 9/11, after the changes we've made in the police, we should have a public discussion on whether or not this is a choice that's still appropriate and where the line should be drawn. I mean, personally, I'd advocate for keeping the law and maybe streamlining it a little bit. But it's a good law. It protects us. But it's a choice we make as a society.
And it does seem like this public discussion is starting. I mean, there's the police chief has said he wants to sort of rethink it. The mayor has said, well, maybe, maybe not. What's prompting this, as I understand, is the federal government is creating a big database, an anti-terrorism database, really. And the question is, can Seattle plug into that? What's the problem there?
Well, the problem is that people from the outside who look at our law see a provision that says a citizen auditor is going to look at the police files every year and check to see if there's any restricted information on citizens, and then if they find it, they have the ability to disclose that information to the target of the investigation. Now, as a law enforcement person, you're going to step back and say, well, wait a second, someone whom I have no control over, who's a citizen who I've never met, is going to make a decision on whether to disclose my files, and there's no judicial input, there's no right to appeal. It can become a very difficult thing for law enforcement
So it's the
officers.
federal government that's worried about including a place like Seattle with this quote-unquote liberal law, civil liberty law, if you will. They're worried about giving Seattle access to that database because then the database, in effect, is no longer secret.
Yes.
Or it
Well,
could,
yeah,
in
that's
fact,
it.
the terrorists could learn if they're on this list if it sort of flows through a city like Seattle.
That's their worry. Whether they ever would is a separate question, and I doubt the federal government is really in the business of obtaining information about the things that are prohibited here. Remember, this law does allow investigation of criminal activity. It says that they can collect restricted information if there's a reasonable belief that a crime is going to be committed or has been committed, and I think those are the kind of files we're looking at. So I think in reality, we're protected under this law, but I think from an outsider's perspective, they're going to worry because they don't quite understand how the law operates.
There is some fear, and to be fair, I guess the federal government hasn't for sure said this. In fact, the database isn't even quite ready yet.
That's right.
But they're wondering about whether, indeed, if it is. We had this kind of problem, didn't we, during WTO?
Yeah, WTO is actually a very interesting example of how this works. If you read the police after action report, one of their criticisms is that they would have been able to do more things but for the existence of this law. Now, they freely admit that they made mistakes, and I don't think they ever intended to use the intelligence law as a scapegoat for themselves. But they did. The staff report on WTO says, but look at all the information that they had. And during WTO, there was a period where the Seattle Police Department was excluded from intelligence meetings that the federal government and other agencies were having because of the intelligence law. Now, they were ultimately allowed to participate in those meetings. And I don't think anybody has ever argued that but for the intelligence law, WTO would not have happened, because I think that there are other things that wouldn't work there.
But the idea was, at least for a while, that the federal government, who was sort of participating in the planes, security warnings and stuff, were worried about letting Seattle police join those discussions for fear that then it becomes, an open record in effect. Right now, there's an auditor function in this. Yes. So an auditor, separate, I don't know, civilian person, looks over the files, I guess, every year of the Seattle Police Department, and if they have any cause to believe that the police department has violated this rule, as to say, collected information, inappropriately, then they turn around and they alert the target of that. Yeah. That, hey, there's been a file open on you and you're eligible to get some money from the city.
And that's right. It has a private right of action, which is a pretty big hammer. That if we discovered that there was a file on Sierra Douglas and the auditor told you, you could then sue, and perhaps even the officer individually. So in terms of keeping the officers from doing this, the police department works at a higher level than even the law allows. They require probable cause, which is a higher legal standard than reasonable suspicion, before they obtain restricted information.
Because they're wanting to make sure they're on the right side of this ordinance.
Yes.
How many times has the auditor found that the Seattle Police Department has gone astray of this?
I'm not aware of any, but I have not tracked it for years, and those reports, I mean, I guess I see them now, but I haven't followed them. I don't know.
But it's certainly not something that's happened.
And I'm not aware of any cases where they've been sued. There's no reported cases under this law. So no, it's not a very common occurrence, and I think it's because the police do a good job of not doing the things that are prohibited here.
We just have about a minute left. Is one possible solution or one possible way to tweak this to just eliminate the public disclosure part of it? In other words, just amend the law so that you don't have all that access to the files.
Yeah, but that might eliminate the value of the law. The public disclosure is what keeps the people feeling that they're safe. And as I said, this is an appropriate subject for a public debate, that people discuss whether or not this is a protection we need under the risks after 9/11 in the world we live in today.
And the public debate is hopefully something we've helped start today.
Yes.
Tom Carr, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
You are the city attorney for Seattle. Stay tuned. Up next, Jerry Sheehan. He's the legislative director for the ACLU. We continue this discussion in a moment. We now welcome Jerry Sheehan. He is the Legislative Director of the ACLU of Washington. Welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
What is so bad about this federal database that Seattle can't plug into it?
Well, I'm not so sure what's so bad about it. I don't quite understand really what it all is intending to amount to. But we do have grave concerns that in the post 9/11 era, when the federal law enforcement authorities have been given stronger authority to be collecting information about citizens on the basis of their religious views or their political views, without having to believe that the person may be engaged in wrongdoing, is a problem for our society. For the Seattle Police Department to be then able to be tapping into those databases on that kind of worrisome information, it should be a problem for us as a city.
But don't we, is there a new era? Does the ACLU sort of recognize that post 9/11 things have to be a little bit different, that law enforcement does have to work in a different way?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Post the heinous tragedy of 9/11, when it was revealed that law enforcement was doing a terrible job, were engaged in battles over turf between the CIA and the FBI and the local police or whatever. I mean, it was clear to all of us that the government was not doing the proper job of ensuring the security of the nation. That certainly should be remedied. That does not, however, mean that abrogating the civil rights and the Bill of Rights is the way to have the government be doing a better job.
You don't think there's any cause for lowering, even slightly, the sort of standard that maybe a law enforcement entity uses to track terrorists, to track people that they have suspicions might commit terrorist acts?
It's been clear in our history that any time that our nation has been shocked by such a tragedy in various ways, be it entering into a war as in World War II, or be it having to do with the Cold War, our political institutions have reacted in a way that has been very detrimental to our society by that theory of we need to lower our constitutional standards. Americans were sent to concentration camps because of their ancestry during the Second World War, right here in our own region. People were hounded out of their positions by J. Edgar Hoover because of their political views. At the time, during the Cold War, at the times of national trials and tribulations, we in fact should be adhering much more strictly to what the government is doing, allegedly in our own best interest.
And so your problem here is that Seattle has a certain standard, a pretty strict standard in this intelligence ordinance about what police can and can't do, what they can collect, surveillance, informants, all the rest, and that this federal database has a lesser standard. In effect, the Justice Department and others have sort of lessened their standard about sort of who can be tracked and followed because of the terrorism threat, and that they don't meet. That is to say, if you bring the national database in with the Seattle database, you've got different standards.
Yes, and it may not be really even a problem. I know the federal authorities are concerned about Seattle's law, and it's not clear to me yet that it is truly a problem. I have a beginning feeling here that we just have federal authorities in some respect reacting the way they always do, that they know better. That anytime they encounter a state law or a city ordinance that deals in matters that they believe they have strong concerns in, that of course the locals couldn't have gotten it right. And so, we're a lot more skeptical of the federal view, as I think I see it, that they always know what is better. And so we would certainly examine any proposed changes.
And briefly, why? Why is it that if you acknowledge there are different standards, and let's just posit that for a second, why then might it still be all right for Seattle to plug into a national database?
Oh, because if you really examine the Seattle ordinance closely, you really see that it is saying that the Seattle Police Department should not be creating files on individuals, Jerry Sheehan, and putting in those files what his political views might be, for example. It's not clear to us that the ordinance precludes the Seattle Police Department from talking with the FBI about information that the FBI might have when they perhaps jointly have to do some kind of operation. That would presumably not be the Seattle Police Department creating a file about Jerry Sheehan per se, from information that the FBI might have.
Even if the entity they're talking to, the FBI, has a different standard of
perhaps
when they'll
yes.
investigate and
perhaps
open a
so,
file.
yeah. The Seattle law is really talking about creating Jerry Sheehan files in Seattle on inappropriate stuff that's unrelated to any criminal activity for the SPD.
And I guess it turns out that with WTO, there was, as Tom Carr has said in our previous segment, we were eventually, maybe eventually it's too long, we were pretty quickly allowed in the meetings with the FBI. I mean, there was some question at first
Sure.
about whether the FBI, because of our ordinance, wanted to include us in their intelligence, and then they ultimately did. And
Sure, exactly so. In fact, the SPD's after incident report that he alluded to did assert that the local ordinance was a problem for their planning. Well, in fact, the city examined that question later on, and they had a commission of illustrious Seattleites, including a former Seattle police detective, in fact, who wound up saying, no, that assertion is unsupported by any law.
And I guess among other
Any
things,
evidence.
because ultimately they were allowed
Sure.
to talk to, among other things, they were allowed to talk to FBI and that kind
That's
of stuff.
right.
This must happen at some point on a local level anyway. I mean, Seattle, I think, is the only place in the city with this kind of, or in the state with this kind of ordinance. What now do we do when we're trying to tap into a King County's database or the Washington State Patrol database or Bellevue's database? You know?
Well, apparently you don't have to do anything because the law has been in existence for 23 years. I've never heard King County or Pierce County or Tacoma or Bellevue or the State Patrol saying, we won't play with SPD because of your law. There's been never such an example given.
Even if they don't have this kind of law.
Even if they don't have the similar restrictions in their own department.
What if it is determined, what if the feds say, when they get this database up and running, Seattle, we've looked at your law and we're just not going to let you. We're not going to let you in this because it'll hamper our terrorism. And the idea briefly is that if a terrorism might get alerted, in other words, if Seattle participates in the auditor might be forced to alert a terrorist, you've been spied on, or that kind of thing. So let's say the federal government says, Seattle, you can't do this, you're not a part of our database. Is that worth it for Seattle? I mean, don't we want to be a part of a national database? Don't we want to help catch terrorists? Won't the terrorists come to Seattle if we've got
Of course,
no
sure.
database?
Yeah.
We don't know who they are. It's going to be a safe haven. This is going to be the biggest cell in the country. Jerry Sheehan responds.
That's right, yes indeed. And that's the kind of assertion that the government makes all the time, that if we don't do X, everybody will come here to do X against the law. Obviously, that won't be the case. I certainly accept
I mean, why obviously?
Oh, because the federal government will not exclude the largest municipal police department in our state from participating legitimately in law enforcement activities with the federal government. It simply won't happen. I certainly don't accept for a moment that hypothetical. It's just not going to happen. When the FBI was testifying before the legislature this past January on the wiretap proposal down there, the FBI was saying, well, if you don't change the state law to make it easier for locals to do wiretap stuff, well, we'll still give the locals the information that we feel the locals need to have in a specific incident.
You think they'll cave ultimately?
They clearly will cave. They've always done it in the past.
Why does the Seattle police chief and other members of the department want this law to be changed?
Well, I certainly can't speak for them, but
Does it go beyond just this federal database issue?
I think probably it does, because the question has arisen out of various past chiefs over the last 23 years of the ordinance. And I think, charitably saying, it's simply a matter that what profession wants to be told by some outside oversight body or law how to do its job. You know, we all individually in our own professions believe we really know how to best to do our jobs. And that may not be the case as an argument, however, in this
30
context.
seconds. Do you think the police right now are abiding by this law?
I believe they are, because in the 23 years of the ordinance, I've never heard any example where the police have had to be called on the carpet, and that's a good sign for the law and the department, I think.
Indeed, I think you say the police might be not abiding by it also, insofar as they're not fully doing what they maybe are allowed to under the law.
Maybe so.
They're maybe too cautious.
They may need to have some training that shows them, in fact, what the full flexibility of the law truly is.
Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
Jerry Sheehan is the Legislative Director of the ACLU of Washington State. Thank you all for watching. Join us next week for another edition of City Inside Out. Until then, on behalf of our talented studio crew here, I'm C.R. Douglas. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.